I want to do two stories together. It's Old Testament stories. And the first is the story of Tobit. Now, I picked this story, about many stories I was picked, because this story, in many ways, if you want a story to understand sexual abuse in the church, you can't order one from the catalog or make one up that would fit like this one. This is the story of Tobit. And again, it's an archetypal story. We don't think Tobit was an historical character. And he's telling this story. And it goes this way. Tobit says, I, Tobit, had a great reputation for holiness and righteousness in the community. And one day, I'm sitting down to eat my dinner, and my son comes in and says, Father, there's a dead body in the market squares. Now, in Judaism in those days, if you touched the dead body, you were contaminated. So everybody was scared to touch it. And you couldn't eat for some days. So Tobit says, without eating, I got up from the table, went to the market squares, took the body, washed it, dressed it, and buried it. And now he comes home after doing this wonderful, virtuous deed, but now he can't eat. He's contaminated. So what did I do? He said, I went into the garden to take a sleep. And I lay under a tree, not knowing that there were birds above me. And as I tried to sleep, the droppings of the birds came down into my eyes. Now, this is not very glamorous. He's getting bird shit in his eyes. He said, I felt the burning, and the more I tried to rub it out, the more I rubbed it in, inadvertently. He said, till I went almost blind, and I went to see the doctors, and I spent all my money on the doctors, but they made it worse. In fact, at a point, I went completely blind. And now he's blind, he's home, and he said, my wife, Anna, she used to weave some pieces of cloth for rich people, and one day she wove a particularly fine piece of cloth, and she gave it to a man, and the patron said, I'm giving you your wages because the cloth is so fine, I'm also giving you a young kid to take home. So she takes this baby goat, she brings it in the house, and Tobit said, being blind, I heard the goat bleat. So I said to my wife, where did you get this goat? You stole it, surely. And she said, no, I didn't. It was given to me in addition to my wages. He said, I don't believe you. Take it back. He said, then my wife's anger flared and she says, yes, you, virtuous one. Everybody's known all these years your hypocrisy and who you really are. He said, then hearing this from the mouth of my wife, I went out into the garden and I began to weep and I began to pray. And that's the beginning of Tobit's conversion. Now let's take that story. He's a virtuous man. He's a good man, okay? But he has some major blind spots that he doesn't see. Well, his wife sees them, okay? And he's got to hear it from his wife before he knows it. And then something powerfully unglamorous happens to him. The last thing you want happen to you, and he goes blind, okay? And then in his blindness, his mood deteriorates, and then his wife has to confront him before he begins his conversion. Take the sexual abuse crisis. Take Roman Catholicism, the churches in general. We have, and deservedly so, a long historical reputation for doing a lot of really good things. But we've also had some blind spots. And then what happened to us, the most unglamorous of all things. People who do literature in Dark Nights of the Soul, they say, Dark Nights of the Soul will always hit you where? The very last place you want to be hit. The one Achilles heel, where you say, anything but that. That's what's going to happen to you. See, so the Catholic Church, along with a few of the evangelicals and the Muslims today, were the only people who still fight for chastity and so on. We have a celibate clergy. So where are we going to get hit? The last place with celibacy and the clergy. Okay. And then, like Tobit, we tried to rub it out. But the more we rubbed it out, the more we rubbed it in. And then he spent all his money on doctors. We spent all our monies on lawyers, and it didn't help. It made everything worse. Okay? Until we went completely blind. And then the criticism came. The powerful criticism didn't come from the Boston Globe. It came from within, where people are saying we're hypocrites. And now we're going to be a much, much better church for that. But that's also true in our own personal lives. Those are dark nights. the times we get bird shit in our eyes, and you'll know what that metaphor means. That's a metaphor. It's analogical. Okay. Okay. Not very poetic, but it's analogical. Okay. That leads us to our conversion. He said, then hearing this from my wife, her calling me a hypocrite, he said, then I went outside and I began to weep and I began to pray. Then he comes back a much, much stronger man. Okay, great story. Jonah. Look at the book of Jonah. Okay. It's interesting, when they come to Jesus and they ask for a miracle, and notice Jesus doesn't like doing miracles. Okay. He'll do miracles for compassion, and sometimes he'll do miracles for the sake of revelation, but he'll never do a miracle to prove God's existence. Say, do a miracle. Remember, he always says, an evil and adulterous generation wants a sign, and no sign will be given it except the sign of Jonah. Interesting. What is the sign of Jonah? Jesus said, no miracles except the sign of Jonah. But you can see that Jonah fires in about 3 different ways. But this is the story of Jonah. And again, we don't suspect he was an historical prophet, that this is, in the beginning, kind of a story. Okay? So they say, Jonah. Jonah was a prophet. And remember, this is being written for Jews, and they believe prophets listen to God. Okay? So, God appears to Jonah and says, I want you to go to Nineveh and preach to the people and tell them if they don't repent, in 40 days I'm going to destroy the city. Now, Jonah has 2 problems with that. First of all, he doesn't believe it. Secondly, he hates the Ninevites and he wants them destroyed. This like if he went to San Antonio and said, they're going to destroy Dallas. Say, good. No, he hated the Ninevites. So what does Jonah do? Nineveh's to the north. He gets on a ship sailing south, as far away as he can from Nineveh. But God doesn't let him get away with it. So there's a storm at sea. They find out that Jonah has disobeyed God. They pitch him into the ocean. And a whale swallows him up, swims him up to Nineveh, and coughs him up on the shore. So now he's got to do this. Okay? So he goes into Nineveh, and he's half-hearted. He is faithless. He doesn't believe this is going to work. And not only that, he hopes it's not going to work because he wants them destroyed. So he walks into the city and says, repent, or in 40 days, God is going to destroy this city. And you know what happened? Everything happened the exact opposite. They said the people were cut to the marrow. The king got off his throne. All the people repented. The king repented. He called the general fast, and he even made the animals fast. The cows and horses got into this. That was the greatest, homily ever preached, And so they all convert. So what happens to Jonah? Is he happy? No. He goes out of the city, he goes into suicidal depression. He tells God, I want to kill myself. He's just had a marvelous success, He says, I want to kill myself because he didn't want the Ninevites to convert. And then there's this little teasing text that said, so God had this tree grow up that gave him shade, and he thought, God, this is great, And then he was really cheered up for a day, and then a worm came at night and killed the tree. Then he goes back into a suicidal depression again, So God appears to him and says, do you have a right to be depressed? And Jonah said, absolutely, suicidally depressed. God says, why? He said, you just had a success. He said, I'm God. I would have reason to be depressed. He said, I look at all the people in the world and people aren't converting and so on. It's the end of the story of Jonah. Now, a couple of things in there. First of all, prophet's supposed to listen to God. Well, in fact, he doesn't listen to God. So it goes against him. But then it turns out the opposite he wanted, and then it goes against his expectations. But let's move to the sign of Jonah. Okay. Jesus said, no sign will be given except the sign of Jonah, which in the New Testament is the resurrection. The unexpected miracle, the huge miracle. But here it means that the daily miracle, where the king gets off his throne. See, Jesus says, don't look so much for miracles of the parting of the Red Sea or, resurrections and stones moving back. But watch for it in this sense. Just when you think it's hopeless, your enemy's going to convert. Just when you think it can never happen, that's when it's going to happen. That the miracles are in everyday life. Karl Rahner, wonderful theologian, someone once said to him, do you believe in miracles? He said, no. said, I rely on them to get through each day. See, miracles isn't necessarily what happens at Fatima or Lourdes or whatever, or Guadalupe. Miracles are what happen in your life when your daughter, makes the right decision, when this happens, and just when you don't expect. Jesus says, don't expect, rocks moving away from gravestones very often, but expect in daily life, and especially just when you think it's hopeless and when you haven't been faithful. It's not ever going to happen because you've been faithful and so on. Maybe you've been lazy and wrong and errant and everything else, and just when you think, I don't deserve it, and it's all wrong, and this person hates me, that's when the person is going to surprise you. See, it's a surprise in everyday life. There's a beautiful New Testament parallel text to that in John's Gospel. When you look at the resurrection miracles, when Jesus appears in the resurrection, this doesn't happen smoothly. Sometimes we get the naive thing that Jesus rose on Easter Sunday and they were all on fire and hyped and so on. It didn't work like that. He'd make discreet appearances and then they believed it, and then a day later, did this really happen? And they didn't quite believe it. And then they went up and down. Then they'd go back to fishing at the sea. So at one point, the disciples went back to fishing at the sea. It went back to their old lives. They abandoned their old lives, And John has a particularly powerful text. He said, one night Peter said, I'm going fishing. And the apostle said, we'll go with you. That's a powerful text. That I'm going back to my old way of life. So they went back. That means they're abandoning a dream. Then John said they fished the whole night and they caught nothing. See, so once you've met Jesus and you turn away, it's not going to work anymore. Okay? Then in the morning, just when they've spent a night of emptiness, John said they smelled fresh fish across the water, and they looked on the shore, and there was Jesus frying some fish, grilling fish in a fire. John said, nobody had to ask, who are you? They knew. He was back. See, just when you give up, the sign of Jonah, just when you give up, you'll smell the fish. See, this is metaphor. See, and when you read the text literally, you lose all of this. See, fundamentalism of text, it's not so much that it's wrong, it's just, it's so impoverishing.